is NATO's role now? How has it changed? How is it likely to change? And more broadly, what are the implications of those changes for Europe, for the regions in which it operates, and for its members? I have asked a panel to address this question, a panel which is uniquely qualified to do so, and I'd like to introduce them. On my left, from Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, is Professor Taylor Seybolt, who is a PhD from MIT and the author of several volumes related to this topic, most recently, Humanitarian Military Intervention, The Conditions for Success and Failure, and an edited volume, Counting Civilian Casualties, an Introduction to Recording and Estimating Non-Military Deaths. Here at Pitt, he was, in addition to his role as an assistant professor, director of our Ford Institute for Human Security, and has spent time working at the programs and working for both the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington and the Stockholm Peace Research Institute in Sweden. On my right is a guest at the University of Pittsburgh, Marina Skordeli. Marina comes to us from Greece, where she is director of the Jean Monnet Center at the University of Athens. And she has, unlike the rest of us, actually been involved in politics and advising. In fact, she was an advisor to former Prime Minister and now MP Kostas Karamanlis, and continues to be involved in advising insofar as possible. Any parliaments can be advised on subjects of foreign policy. Her PhD is from Athens, where she focused on European security and defense policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm happy to say she comes from one of my favorite cities in Greece, Thessaloniki, where her undergraduate degree was. She has written recently on NATO for the NATO Review in an article entitled The Way Forward, 60 Years from the Accession of Greece and Turkey to NATO. Joining us from Great Britain is my friend and colleague, Gulnur Aybet. Hello. Where Gulnur is Senior Lecturer in International Relations and the Department of Politics at the University of Kent. She has multiple degrees from all over Great Britain, but also, in addition to her role at Kent, she is a visiting professor of international relations at Izmir University of Economics in Turkey. She has published widely on very questions we're going to discuss today, most recently co-author with Rebecca Moore on NATO in Search of a Vision. And she's a regular commentator on a variety of affairs. In fact, my view is if you haven't read Gulnur somewhere in the internet, then you are not paying attention. Joining us finally from University of Illinois is Professor Ryan Hendrickson, who is from the Department of Political Science at Eastern Illinois. His PhD is from the University of Nebraska, and he too has published, especially on the subject of NATO, most recently, Diplomacy and War at NATO. I couldn't have chosen a better person, it seems to me. The Secretary General and Military Action After the Cold War. But he has also worked on American foreign policy, in particular, the question of war powers, the Constitution, Congress, and war powers, from Vanderbilt University Press. Let me set the stage a bit for our panelists by addressing what seems to have been NATO's evolution from its establishment as a bulwark against communism, especially Soviet communism, in the days of the Cold War, to its evolution into what might be called the shield of democracy. Not exactly uncontroversial terminology, but let's accept it for the moment, behind which the newly democratizing states of East Europe could formulate democracy and become members. It then became, one might argue, the sword of democracy, going to war as an ethnic protector in the Balkans, especially of the Kosovo Albanians, where it has had begun and remains a peacekeeper and, in some cases, a peacemaker. Since then, especially since 9/11, NATO has taken on an active role as an anti-terrorism organization, including in the Eastern Mediterranean, as I'm sure most of you know, but also, as I'm sure you also know, in Afghanistan. Even more recently, and perhaps more aggressively, NATO undertook intervention in Libya on behalf of the rebels there as a promoter, successfully, of regime change. Clearly, NATO is not a museum piece. It is not rolling off into the sunset, even though one might argue that its original purposes, causes, adversaries, and raison d'etre are no longer there. In fact, quite the opposite. It has taken on more burdens in a wider variety of areas, which now may or may not expand. So the question I put to the panel is NATO at a changing point? Is it about to evolve into something else? And I pose this question for the following reason. In addition to the background, we've seen NATO act aggressively in Libya and not act at all in Syria. So is that a crucial deciding moment? Are there other moments and other issues ahead? So I pose that question. I would make one piece of technical advice. That still applies, right, Allison, about muting at the
I'm doing it.
Okay. You need not worry about it. We have radar radio on the scene right here. So who would like to engage my question? And you can do so in any way except by telling me that my introduction was wrong. Can't do that.
Your introduction was great, but shall I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to begin with the question that you asked us, is NATO at a changing point? And I think I'd like to answer that with another question. When has NATO not been at a changing point? I mean, this evolution, we sort of think that there was a Cold War era and the post-Cold War era, but it's not really that black and white. It's been constantly evolving. And when you think about the many crises that NATO has been through at the height of the Cold War, when you'd think the glue would be so set, bringing the allies together, even then they disagreed on certain things. But I think, you know, the big evolution of, obviously, as you pointed out rightly, was this 1990s. But in your introduction, you sort of separated that into two roles, the shield of democracy and the sword of democracy. I think that the shield and the sword were quite interchangeable and overlapping throughout the 1990s, which is why the sword role of NATO actually had some legitimacy, because it was backed by the normative role, which was the shield. I think once it turned into the third stage of its evolution, this anti-terrorist organization, as you mentioned, after 9/11, that's when I think we had a sort of separation in the ways of the shield and the sword. The sword was very much operational, you know, it was there, but the shield question was, well, it has a question mark over it. And, you know, that's initially what I would say in terms of, you know, food for thought out there. With Libya, Syria, I reckon that, you know, and we will return to this as we're going on, but Libya, in a sense, was so unique that there were certain things that made it possible, such as a consensus in the North Atlantic Council, first of all, and the passing of a UN Security Council resolution made possible with the abstaining of Russia and China. And then you also had the convergence of the Arab League, so that gave it regional legitimacy. And then thirdly, you already had two NATO allies who were practically involved and leading the operation before NATO took it over, who had the political will and the capabilities. Now, I don't think you're going to get a convergence of all of those factors all together at the same time again. And that's what I think it was unique. And that's why I can't really see all of those things coming together again over Syria. And most of all, I mean, I don't think we're going to get a UN Security Council resolution at all. So that's one of the reasons. But anyway, I think I'll stop there because those were just some of the points that I, picked up from your introduction, and just to sort of give some food for thought out there.
Thank you.
Well, I understand that the case of Syria and Libya are two completely different situations. But I wouldn't like to focus so much on Libya and Syria, because these things can come back and forth all the time in the history of NATO. I would like to start by first remark saying that we have been dealing with this debate for more than 20 years now. Ever since the end of the Cold War. And we have always been worried whether NATO will have a role in the future or not. But throughout these 20 years or more, NATO has proved that it has a role and that it is relevant. I would like also to point to the title of this panel, which is very relevant. We say a hammer in search of a nail. And it makes me think whether we're looking for trouble here. I mean, whether we are trying to justify our role by inventing security risks or reasons to intervene on our own, or whether security risks are actually there. And I think that nails are always going to be there, because unfortunately the world is not pacified yet. And I'm not seeing it coming for the next years. So security risks might change, but they're still there. Now it's terrorism. Right after the end of the Cold War, it was the Balkans. That was a combat mission in Kosovo that NATO had to undertake. Then it was Afghanistan. Now it's Libya. And I think, unfortunately, there are going to be more challenges in the future. So the issue here is there a consensus inside NATO as to what kind of risks it wants to address? And most probably this kind of consensus will come, as it always comes, from the kind of the security risks that we have to face, if they are compelling or not. September 11 was compelling, and it created consensus on its own. So maybe the next security risks that will come will create this consensus again on their own. So I think I'm going to stop here for the moment, but there are many issues that we could build upon by exploring how we will create this security strategy consensus for the future.
So I see crucial points in the development of NATO's history, and I agree that it's an organization that has shown itself to be constantly in a state of evolution. I think that there's a consistent trend, though, since the end of the Cold War. That's the trend of expansion. The way you categorize the changes are sort of by, if you will, purpose of the organization. We can look at this in a different way and categorize by structure and behavior. So at the end of the Cold War, there was this grand debate about whether or not NATO should exist and will exist. And lo and behold, as you said, it expanded from 16 countries to 28 today. Territorial expansion in terms of the membership. So that was, in my mind, one major, not turning point, but a crucial moment in its evolution. Second crucial moment for me is when it first engaged in combat operations over Bosnia in, what was it, about 20 years ago. And then the third crucial point is out-of-area operations well beyond Europe in Afghanistan and Iraq. So we've seen a continual expansion territorially and in terms of the kinds of problems that the alliance is engaged in. And for me, the question is that expansion going to continue, or is this going to be a period of retrenchment? And one last point. I think that the original reasons for NATO do still exist.
Those three?
In modified form, yeah. Okay. If you're worried about a Eurasian land power, if you're worried about conflict within the NATO members, and keeping the U.S. in Europe.
All right. I want to be sure and come back to that.
Yeah.
But I want to give Professor Hendrickson a chance to join us
Sure.
as well, especially on those questions of the tasks that NATO has undertaken.
Well, let me begin by echoing a couple of points that a couple of presenters made, which is that I think almost all of the scholarship, even during the Cold War, suggested that NATO was in crisis. I mean, we can open almost any book and say the title is NATO in turmoil, NATO in crisis, and then we have the post-Cold War era where similar arguments are made. So it's really nothing new for NATO to be facing almost kind of metaphysical type questions about what its role shall be in the future. I guess in terms of task, and my biggest concerns are defense spending. This to me is sort of the future challenge for NATO having the ability to address crises around the world. The French actions in Mali are really intriguing to me because it suggests to me that the French are often willing to act independently, but in this case, they really ran forward. No interest in NATO from their part. No outreach to NATO, it seems to me. And even as the Libya bombing campaign began, France also was similarly sort of hesitant to reach out to NATO and allow NATO to play a role. Well, they eventually did, but there was resistance in the French government. So one of the tasks, I think, or challenges for NATO is this defense spending argument, which we've heard for many, many years. But I think we might be at the stage where the differences are so profound between some of the between some of the wealthier European allies or the European allies who are willing to spend and those that aren't. I think we have a point where there is a much higher possibility for sort of a political fissure in NATO and the possibility of coalitions developing within NATO and others being sort of left out. So that's, I would suppose, my biggest concern about the future of NATO.
Let me follow up on your point right at this moment to compare it to the United States and Afghanistan after 9/11. As you well know, NATO offered to invoke Article 5, and the United States said, thank you very much, but we went in on our own. And only later did it become a NATO mission. And of course, the disparity in capabilities and logistics and spending has always been huge, with the United States disproportionately, especially in our view, spending. So how is what you described fundamentally different and likely to produce a crisis that NATO hasn't seen before?
Because I think the gap has widened such that you have countries like France and the UK who are increasingly, it seems to me, so much different from many of the other allies that the incentives for those countries to reach out to other NATO allies for help decreases dramatically. And I don't think, for example, the French wants to listen to German oppositions to different targeting decisions they may make. Or the same could be argued about perhaps the Italians. I'm just speaking in a hypothetical way here. But that to me is, I think the gap has widened so much now that you have higher disincentives to think in a multilateral framework that NATO has previously offered that gives greater incentives for the creation of coalitions in NATO. So, who knows for sure about the future, but it seems to me the gap is wider.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to your point, Taylor, about the expansion of tasks. In a way, if we look at it that way, don't we obscure or push aside the fact that the tasks can only be taken on if there's the political will to do so? In other words, theoretically, NATO could have eschewed those tasks, and we're not going to do this.
Right.
But they didn't. They also could have done the same on expansion, although you might argue there were other issues. So to focus on tasks, if we do that, aren't we missing the crucial political evolution of the alliance? Or I got the impression, let me put it in the most contentious way, it looks like the tasks were leading the alliance rather than the other way around.
Well, I think the critical question is the one that Marina, sorry about that. Marina put forward, which is this question of whether or not there's a consensus about what the security risks are. So it's not the tasks so much as I see tasks as a response to risk perception, and how risk is perceived depends on who is in the alliance. The territorial expansion and the expansion of members made a big difference in that, I think. And it's also the ways in which the major alliance members, particularly the U.S., define their grand strategy and their international interests. And so if you have just a few countries dominating the definition of risks, then it really depends on the foreign policy of those countries more than on NATO as an organization.
So the U.S. is still the big dog in this particular determination, or as Ryan Hendrickson was arguing, others may now be, let's say, contending for the position of what George Bush used to call as the decider. Or is it still basically a U.S. show and the others just follow along?
Well, I wouldn't say it's just a U.S. show and others follow along, but without a doubt, the U.S. Has the majority vote, if you will, in terms of the amount of military spending and the technology to coordinate the operational level of interactions between these militaries when they're in the field. If the U.S. decided not to be engaged at all, if we pulled out of the military command structure, it would be a fundamentally different organization. So yes, the U.S. is the 600-pound gorilla, not the 800-pound gorilla.
Gulnur, let me come back to you. You have paid attention in your scholarship to NATO's sort of official and quasi-official evolution. Do you think NATO has come up with a consensus on its risks going forward, or are we just sort of making a series of ad hoc decisions as to the latest crisis?
Yeah, I think that in terms of this diversity that's emerging among allies that Ryan also alluded to, it's not just about budgets, it's also about a serious widening gap in threat perceptions. And I think we'll see more of that. It seemed to me that during the Cold War, obviously, the threat perception gap wasn't there because there was a threat and that was fine. After the Cold War, there seemed to be, anything that seemed to sort of threaten the legitimacy, if you like, of this sort of post-war order that was being salvaged and recreated and resalvaged after 1990 seemed to be a threat. So I think the threat was very normative. There were normative challenges to a liberal world order and democratic governance, and that seemed to be, and I think in that sense there was also consensus, because you can't really disagree that not wanting to salvage those things is a bad thing. You can't really say that we shouldn't really be doing this because this is none of our business. But I think eventually after this sort of post 9/11 period, you get more of the sort of the increasing threat perception. Especially when you have, allies asking for certain caveats in missions like Afghanistan. They don't all want to go into combat. Some allies don't really see the sort of threat-wise urgency of missions like Afghanistan, but they go along with it because they want to keep the Americans committed. So sometimes missions themselves become disguised for certain allies for different political motivations rather than the actual reason for the mission itself. And I think that's a big danger, because if you get a consensus that is built on individual self-interests that are quite divergent from one another, but they happen to come together in a seeming consensus because that's the only way that they can hold on to their own little corners, if you like, of their interests. I think that sort of creates a very shaky consensus. And that is something to watch out, I think, for the future.
It sounds like a club which has evolved into an organization whose whole purpose is to keep it in business, but which doesn't really have a real aim anymore.
And I think but I think on the other hand, one thing that is probably enduring, so I'm not a total pessimist, is that I don't think, no matter how much the allies may not publicly say this, but they're sort of secret among themselves to each other, they'll probably say that, you know, we have these diverging threat perceptions. But despite that, I think there is a convergence that nobody would want to give up Article 5. I mean, it's the biggest insurance policy in the world. Why would you give that up once you've got it? So again, I think, you know, the value of that is definitely there, and that's going to endure. What I worry about is, you know, the normative role. I mean, does it mean the same for everybody in NATO nowadays? I'm not sure about that. And the widening threat perception. So, yeah.
Marina, I'd like to draw on Gulnur's comments, but also several of the people who've spoken so far have alluded to a normative or a legitimizing role, which suggests that NATO, as much as it's a military alliance, it has a kind of moral code or moral standard that it's applying and is likely to continue to apply now that Europe is essentially. Do you see that as part of NATO's future role in either the Eastern Mediterranean or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I think that NATO, being a normative power, it's where it draws its strength from, and that's why it still is relevant. Because, okay, we can talk about ad hoc coalitions inside NATO or outside of NATO, but it is the NATO umbrella that gives the legitimization to certain kind of operations. And we have to keep in mind that all those different governments, in order for them to have to demonstrate the political will to participate in an operation, they have an electorate, a public opinion that they are accountable to. So they have to prove to them that it is any mission is perfectly legitimized, so that they can acquire the political support inside their own countries and participate in any mission. So I think that NATO functioning as a normative power is very important, especially for the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean, where the public opinion is very sensitive to combat missions of NATO and how they are justified in moral terms. I will take the example of my country, of Greece, which in principle, of course, supports NATO operations and NATO providing security in our region, but politicians always are in a position to explain why a combat mission there and not in other parts of the world where maybe there are same humanitarian risks and security situations that require the same amount of effort, combat interventions. So they are very suspicious of whether there are conspiracy theories behind that, like interests or oil or certain interests of the government behind that. You have to explain to the public all the time. In Greece, let me take the example of Greece because we spoke about the Eastern Mediterranean. Why is a mission legitimized in moral terms? Otherwise, it cannot have the support of the government. So I think that this is very important. to have a consensus on the principles first, so that we can explain this to our public opinions and draw public opinion support behind our missions.
Do you think that issue is an important one for the United States when they're taking action?
The
moral
normative
issue?
legitimacy?
Yes.
I think it's very important, but I don't think that NATO is the place from which it emanates. The international law says that the UN Security Council is the organization or the international body to which we should, as a country, turn first if we want to use force in something other than self-defense. So, it's not NATO that confers legitimacy. It's the UN. Now, if the UN doesn't do that, as in Kosovo, NATO can, I think it's under Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, be the source of legitimacy for military action. But it's not the place of first resort. And so to talk about NATO as a normative organization or normative alliance, I'm not quite sure what that means. It's a political and military alliance, and it offers legitimacy to those acting in its name, but it's not the source of norms or legal authority, in my understanding.
Go ahead, Gulnur.
This normative.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on the normative role because it's true that, NATO can't give legitimacy in the sense that the UN can. But on the other hand, when it does undertake a mission, it does have a normative role. Because, for example, when it was first created, it was more than a military organization. It also stood for the certain sort of principles and values that were behind a liberal world order. So acting in conjunction with a variety of institutions, from Bretton Woods to IMF and the World Bank and UN, and it's part and parcel from its inception of a larger system, and in a sense it's a security community, so it does have a normative role. And I suppose that its normative role during the Cold War was that it was preserving a certain way of life. It wasn't just there for the hardware and the defense. And then in the post-Cold War era, it definitely had a normative role because, like you said in your introduction, it had the shield of democracy role, which was to uphold these values. And precisely the normative role was important in Kosovo because even now, so many years after Kosovo, where it's still quite controversial, there's this argument that, of course, it was illegal because there was no UN Security Council resolution, but on the other hand, it was legitimate because there was a consensus among the allies that it was a humanitarian imperative. So, that humanitarian imperative and legitimacy is also part of its normative role in the sense that it actually went ahead with an operation that didn't have the blessing of the UN, which is incredible. And Russia, the country that objected to that intervention, joined on board afterwards as a member of KFOR. So, at the end, they came on and endorsed that legitimacy. So it's always had a normative role. But picking up on Marina's point about the Eastern Mediterranean and why the normative role is important there, I think there we might run into a little bit of a problem because NATO's normative role has also been tied to its role in the Balkans as a security provider. For example, we did some research on this with my colleague Florian in Bosnia, that, it was NATO's image as the, organization that literally stopped the war and was able to provide security after the war that gave it this legitimacy as an organization that gets things done, but also for what it stands for, upholding democratic governance. Now, it's had this footprint in the Balkans as a security provider and a normative organization, very successful. I think after Libya, where it provided the hardware, obviously, but it didn't follow on with a state-building operation like it did in Bosnia, for very good reasons, because it wasn't asked to. But because it didn't, that actually changes its footprint from the Balkans as a good security provider and also one that has a normative role. So, and the fact that it's impossible for NATO right now to intervene in Syria, again, shows us that, NATO is not a security provider for the region like it was for the Balkans. So I think the time has come to sort of say, well, NATO does have these normative roles. It still upholds these roles, but they're not necessarily linked to its role as a security provider. Because that's the image it has from lingering from the Balkans. That's its Balkan legacy. And when it's trying to engage new partners in the Middle East and North Africa region, this is where it gets into some kind of problems because it is not a security provider for the region. It has to find a new way of engaging these partners. And again, on the legitimacy issue, one last note on Turkey. As you know, Turkey initially was opposed to the Libya operation, and then they came around quite quickly and supported the NATO operation. And the reason for that was because initially they went along with the traditional Turkish view of non-interference in neighboring regional disputes. But once they realized that no matter how much they objected to this, Britain and France were just going to go ahead anyway. In fact, they had done. And they were going to have this ad hoc coalition looming freely in the region. And Turkey much more preferred to bring the whole operation under the North Atlantic Council so that they could have some control over how it could go. Secondly, it would look more legitimate as a regional intervention than some ad hoc European coalition looming loose in the region. So I think increasingly for the Eastern Mediterranean, for allies like Turkey, it will be seen as a legitimizer in that respect. And also a forum where they can have some more control over where operations are going. It'll always be preferred over ad hoc coalitions. So it can also have that role and as a value add, why, one of the answers to why NATO is still there.
Sounds as if, not to be cynical, that what we have is an alliance which is an legitimizer of actions which powerful states want to do anyway. France and Great Britain in the case of Libya, the United States in Afghanistan. And so in that sense, it's not fundamentally different than other alliances. I wonder, and then I want to move off of this sort of normative point because there's a lot more to touch on, but I wonder if NATO is not at what one might call its Rwanda moment. When the United States intervened in Kosovo on behalf of the Albanians, criticism was, why you intervened there when you did nothing in Rwanda? Are Europeans different? Do you care more about them? And they kind of undercut the argument. Well, if NATO has a normative role and if it intervened in Libya to protect the people from a bloodthirsty dictator there, why then is it not doing so in Syria? And I know the answers, of course, but what I mean is, what does that do to NATO's role as either a security provider or a moral legitimizer that doesn't act in Syria?
Yeah.
Anybody want to take
Well, that's why I'm saying that you have to explain to your public opinion why are you intervening in a certain place in the world and not in the other. But in order for you to be able to do so, you have to be clear yourself why you're doing this. And I don't think that the alliance as such, all its individual member states have a consensus as to why they intervene here and not there. The case of Syria for me is very clear as compared to that of Libya. It is a very unique country. I understand that there are certain thoughts behind intervening in Syria that are forbidding right now NATO for doing this big step. But in general, as you pointed to the Rwanda example, you have also to be able to explain to yourself why you are intervening in Libya and not Rwanda, and that makes a clear security strategy that all member states share. And it's not just the share of the United States or Britain or France, but it has to be common goals shared by anyone. I don't think this is very difficult. to share common goals. I think we already do share common goals. The problem is whether we go on combat missions and how we explain this to our public opinion, because combat missions are very costly. Well, in terms of human lives and, of course, in actual financial cost. That is the key, because for the Europeans, it is really a highly sensitive issue whether a country will lose human lives on the spot, in the field. And from that respect, Libya was an easy case because there were no casualties, because it was a hit and run way to conduct operations. But when you put boots on the ground, it is really more sensitive to have a consensus there.
Ryan, do you think the combat mission is what's holding NATO forces back from Syria?
Right. That's the point that Gulnur was making earlier with the differences in threat perception. All of that said, though, I still think NATO's moral legitimacy, that argument is a very important one. I mean, one of the questions that I'm thinking about now is the moral legitimacy of the UN Security Council. I mean, think about the divide there, where we have divides over how to handle North Korea, and where we have problems with Syria and problems with Iran. I mean, the threat perceptions there are quite profound, which I think will possibly make people increasingly look to NATO, perhaps in lieu of UN Security Council authorizations, to take actions. So I think as the EU suffers from its financial problems and its force projection problems, and the UN Security Council suffers from its inability to come to any consensus on some of these bigger issues, NATO's relevance may only increase because of that. I would also add that I think the NATO Secretary General has played a very important role in this, in trying to broaden the security dialogue that NATO's engaged in. Anders Fogh Rasmussen has reached out to partners. He's trying to broaden the dialogue. He made a statement about North Korea, their detonation of the nuclear weapon, a couple weeks ago. And that's really unprecedented for NATO, but it seems to me that's sort of the right thing to be doing, to be thinking in terms of global security and how NATO can respond to those kinds of challenges.
Thank you, and I forgive you for plugging your own book. That's okay. Taylor, did you want to respond to that? So you had raised the Security Council NATO comparison, and I wonder if you want to say anything more on that.
No, I mean, I think we'll leave it there and move on to the rest of your questions.
I want to move us in a slightly different direction, although I must say I didn't expect we'd spend this much time when looking at an alliance talking about moral issues. They would have ridden us out of Washington immediately if we raised those. I want to raise the issue of energy and its role in the alliance. It is ironic, I suppose, that many of the NATO allies, and certainly all of them in East Europe, are heavily dependent on their energy on the former adversary and still hostile power, Russia. And those that aren't are dependent on energy from other parts of the world, which are, to say the least, volatile. So my question is, how can the alliance be robust and powerful in such a situation? But I also look at it from the other perspective. Is the alliance likely to be more aggressive when energy resources are at stake? Or is energy not an important issue compared to moral standing? The last one was a throwaway. Nobody gets to choose that.
Well, I think energy is important, and it's already in NATO policy documents, energy security. In transatlantic, actually, policy documents, EU and NATO share this view that energy security should be protected, even by military means. They start to discuss this option too. So with the dependence on Russia being something that all of NATO member states would like to avoid, and member states turning their attention to not only to the Middle East, which is a given, but also to new energy resources in the Mediterranean now, due to the recent offshore energy findings. I think that it will be an issue to deal with in the future NATO agenda.
The question for me is, obviously energy is fundamentally important. It's what drives all of our economies the world around. And so the countries that comprise NATO are very concerned about it. The question is, how would NATO play a role in energy security? It was originally, as you pointed out, partly an alliance to keep Russia out. Well, if Russia is a major source of energy for Europe, there's a little bit of a contradiction there. So I don't know if talking about energy security as something that can be achieved through NATO is really what states want to do, what European states want to do.
Gulnur?
You asked the question whether energy is going to actually make NATO pursue a more aggressive policy, implying probably that it's going to be more united because it faces a common threat. I think, on the contrary, that rather than pursuing a more aggressive policy, energy is going to be another divider in the alliance. I mean, look at how it's had an impact in the EU, where individual EU countries make their own deals with Russia, and it doesn't say much for alliance, EU cohesion. It's the same thing in NATO, and I think everybody has their own little thing going on with Russia, in the sense that the Eastern European and Central European countries, of course, still view some kind of security apprehension when it comes to Russia, which is why they have been such staunch supporters of alternative routes that would bring in, oil or gas from the Caucasus or the Middle East into Europe via Turkey. But a lot of those plans have been so much up in the air that it's just been going on for a long time. The Nabucco situation, but also look at Turkey as an alliance member trying to diversify all of its energy options, signing up to Nabucco, buying gas from Iran, signing up to the South Stream with Russia, just any sort of option, because they're still all options. And I think, if any of the other countries had the geostrategic position that Turkey had to play with all these options, they'd do exactly the same. If you're an energy dependent country, then you are going to diversify your energy options, and that could become a divisive issue within the alliance, because it's not about norms, it's not about security, it's not about singling out Russia because it's Russia, even though it doesn't constitute an imminent threat, but there's a tradition there. But people are going to act on pure realpolitik. At the end of the day, they'll say, hey, I have to do a deal with Russia now, so I'm not going to sort of say, oh, traditionally, because we're NATO and they're Russia, I shouldn't do this. So I think there'll come a point where some of those normative ties may not tie people together very well. But also recently, this whole thing that I've been reading since yesterday, fascinating, that Turkey is probably going to start its own drilling for shale gas, is probably going to make things totally different if it becomes a country that's not entirely dependent on energy importing. Then that would also change the picture.
I would also add, speaking of shale, there's a line of thought that the United States, which, as we have all recognized, does most of the heavy lifting in NATO, will have even less incentive to do so to protect the oil supply of other countries. After all, most of the Middle Eastern oil that comes out goes not to us, but to Europe or to China. Are we going to put American people in danger, American forces on standby, to protect oil and energy that we don't need. And the less we need it, if shale comes on, then there'll be less incentive to keep the Americans in, to go back to that original formulation. Also, switching to protocol for a moment, I know we have a group of other participants at the University of Illinois, flanking Professor Hendrickson, and I want to not miss an opportunity to let one of them offer a question if they want.
All right, I'll jump in with a question. There's been brief reference to the role of the EU, and this may be a misquote. I'm not an expert on this, but I think I heard recently that the EU now has the second largest number of peacekeeping missions behind the UN, and maybe ahead of NATO. I do realize that those are primarily civilian actions rather than military operations. But my question generally is as the EU is taking baby steps towards getting more engaged in foreign policy, and we know that there are fits and starts and challenges, but as that evolution maybe is beginning to occur, what are the implications for NATO? And again, acknowledging that there are some tricky issues between the EU and NATO membership, Cyprus, et cetera. But I'll just throw that question on the table. Is there a decreasing role for NATO as the EU starts to potentially flex its muscle more?
I could respond to Matt's question and then turn it back to everybody else. But I think NATO very much welcomes these developments with the EU and the civilian peacekeeping roles they play. I don't think that's much of a divisive issue at all. My concern more is getting back to an initial point I made on force projection capabilities and the what was it, the 600 or 800 pound gorilla in the room. I think the French lesson of Mali and their dependency upon American help with aerial refueling and logistical assistance really is it demonstrates just how limited the European Union will be. So in terms of force projection. So yes, it will continue to play peacekeeping role, and that's positive, and NATO will welcome that. But in terms of force projection, I don't think it in any way challenges NATO's capabilities, and it doesn't change much of the debate between the two organizations.
Is it possible that the EU could have the opposite effect by getting involved in situations initially, perhaps because member states are involved, like France, but then find itself needing a greater military capability than it has, and drawing in NATO, even though NATO has not identified it as a threat or taken action? In other words, to use an analogy, the EU is Austria-Hungary to NATO's Germany in 1914.
I don't think, yeah, sorry, did I jump in?
No, go ahead.
I don't think the EU can draw NATO in to something that it hasn't really thought about before. I mean, a majority of NATO members are EU members anyway. So, it's very hard for NATO to be presented with a fait accompli in that sense. But I have to sort of agree with Ryan on the force projection, thing. I mean, it's probably not a good thing to keep saying, there's this very marked distinction between soft and hard power, and the EU does soft power and NATO does hard power. But to some extent, it's true. I mean, the EU does all these missions, and a lot of them, as you mentioned, are civilian ones, and that's really good. But when it actually comes to a sort of hard power military intervention that requires, lift capability, air power, and so forth, the EU don't have these capabilities. And if EU countries do have these capabilities and want to act, as we saw with the case of Britain and France, they do so without going through the EU, as they did in Libya. So they, I mean, the ones that have the capabilities don't necessarily go to the EU. And since Britain is one of the countries that has the key capabilities, I can't really see Britain going to the EU when it wants to lead a mission. Can you? I mean, I really don't see that happening.
Not under David Cameron, no. Taylor, did you want to jump in on that?
No, I think I agree with what was just said. It stretches my imagination to see NATO being drawn into a conflict through something that the EU initiates, or I mean, I think that. Well, I'll just leave it at that. I don't think that there's a danger of that.
Okay.
Because of the overlap that Gulnur just mentioned of EU members and NATO members, these things are not going to suddenly appear from around a blind corner. Diplomats talk to each other all the time, and the EU countries are not going to present NATO with a fait accompli and say, we're invoking Article 5 now. I don't think, do you?
Well, after 9/11, when the United States had never been attacked on its territory before 9/11, let me say, you cannot imagine a situation in which NATO allies would offer us help and protection, and yet they did. Now, initially, the United States said, largely based on its experience at bombing Serbia when it didn't like a committee of 19 telling it what to do, decided to go on its own. And then NATO was drawn in, was very much drawn in. And as Gulnur correctly pointed out, not always willingly and not always adding up. So, I mean, I guess I believe in the never say never. You can imagine French forces getting involved somewhere else in Africa, for example, finding themselves over their head and in a kind, I hate to use, I guess I'm using too many historical analogies, a Dien Bien Phu situation where somebody's got to bail them out. Okay, Mali wasn't that hard. In addition, the state building capability that you mentioned, Gulnur, is really crucial, and it's crucial in Mali. Okay, you can get in there and chase away the fleas, but somebody has to do the state building, and that's going to be the EU, which means, to follow this line of reasoning which I just made up, it means these people are going to be in danger. Well, let's say doing a state building exercise in Mali. Who's going to protect them? The EU's Joint Brigade? They'll land from Britain with tins full of kippers and thinks everybody will salute them, but it won't happen.
Well, but we've seen this in West Africa before, in Liberia and Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone, where European countries have been involved in state building, and it has not drawn in NATO.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's sort of the link that I was wondering about. I'd like to come back to the capabilities issue for a moment. You can't have a discussion on NATO without talking about burden sharing, of course. Let's imagine a scenario which we don't have to imagine. A major power in Washington announces its, quote, pivot towards Asia, redeploys its naval forces, which had been 60-40 Europe and Asia, to 60-40 Asia and Europe, clearly is faced with a rising challenge that it perceives in China. And who is going to take up the slack in Europe? Is it going to be Britain, which is slashing expenditures on the basis of its budgetary difficulties, the EU, which has limited capabilities to begin with? Is there going to be a greater disparity that Ryan referred to in capabilities among those who are left behind to carry the task that the US is less interested in?
Well, my God.
Please.
This is taking us to a long debated issue of constructive duplication, because for some time the transatlantic discussions was on whether the EU military mechanisms should duplicate the NATO ones or not. But we are reaching a point where this is inevitable if the U.S. pivot takes on, as it is the declaration of the Obama administration, then all these elementary facilities, capabilities must be used there, and then the EU will not have, will lack the capabilities to carry on its own missions in its own neighborhood. And this brings me back to the issue that we had before, whether the EU will stick on civilian missions and NATO will do the hard work or not. One day, inevitably, the EU will have to take on responsibility for its own neighborhood. The EU is very good in civilian missions right now. NATO or ad hoc coalitions go in combat missions and they do the dirty job. And then the EU comes and it very effectively does the training, the police training, the military training, the reconstruction job. But in its own periphery, there will be one day that the EU will be compelled to be involved in combat missions too. So that will require capabilities that it now lacks and it has to borrow from the United States, like intelligence and reconnaissance and surveillance and air-to-air refueling and transportation, all these that the US provided in Libya, and it was indispensable for the successful outcome of the Libyan operation. So one day the EU will not be able to rely on the US for these capabilities. The US was leading from behind in Libya, but actually it has a very critical role for the successful outcome that we had in Libya. So if they do not provide those capabilities anymore, then the EU should have to duplicate.
Ryan, you see that happening in your lifetime?
I see, there's a really, a lot of people who write about NATO today make the case that the transatlantic relationship is very, very good right now, much better than the Bush administration years. So in that regard, the ties between the United States and Europe are excellent. And I would add that, yes, Europe needs force projection capabilities, but perhaps we're over deployed in Europe. So this pivot toward Asia really doesn't maybe threaten Europe so much as one might think. But if we could add, we have a question here. Maybe we could, one of our students has a question.
Have the person identify themselves.
Yeah, we'll broaden it. Here we go.
Will it take out if I?
Here we go.
Hello, I'm Rochelle Brunazali, PhD candidate in geography. So yeah, my question sort of follows on what Ryan was just saying. When it comes to the EU's responsibilities in its own neighborhood and the kinds of threats that it might face, and we know that for a long time now, the US has been handing its bases in Germany back over, and it's sort of been giving up a lot of its role there. But it seems to me that a lot of the security issues the EU would face are things that would be taken care of by an organization like Frontex, which hasn't come up yet in the discussion. And so I'm just wondering, it's not an organization I know a lot about, but is this perhaps going to come to the fore of neighborhood security for the European Union? And does it already perhaps have good capabilities to be taking over the sorts of threats that EU would be facing? Border security, organized crime.
Borders.
Yeah, that sort of that seems to be more likely. Was that me? Is that my question?
An organization like
Frontex.
Yeah, how important will Frontex be?
It's an agency for the management of illegal immigration. It's quite recent. It was established in 2005, but it is very active right now, patrolling around the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean against illegal immigration. So I think this is very much to the point what the colleague there has just raised. It's not a military mission. It is a coast guard, so to say, unit, but it is relevant, I think, in the way that let me take you back to what I was saying about energy security. I think that one obvious role that the EU could play was secure the EU in cooperation maybe with NATO, secure maritime communications. That's how it could safeguard energy security. I agree with my colleague from Kent that Turkey should keep its options open, as Greece has to keep its options open as regards to cooperating with Russia or with other energy providers. But this is not what I was saying. I was saying that in military terms, NATO could help energy security by providing security for opening up maritime lanes, safeguarding access from the Middle East or from the countries in North Africa that are also now emerging as energy providers to Western Europe. So I think that European navies could undertake a very critical role there already with active endeavor. Mm-hmm. This is happening. The PSI, which is not a NATO mission, this is a bilateral American and individual countries in the region agreements, and it has to do with control of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. But all this could be encompassed in one mission undertaken whether by NATO or the EU in the region or in cooperation to provide energy security. And this is where Frontex could also come in. Patrolling coasts against illegal immigration could also be one other issue.
Right, and one could argue that the new threats don't look at all like the old threats of armies and state disintegration, but are rather based on illegal immigration, drug trafficking, human trafficking, crime, transborder transmission of organized crime, for example. And I'm not sure NATO is in a very good position to do that. And maybe the EU is better poised.
And the OSCE.
And the OSCE.
As a political counterroute to a military mission.
Well, that's more normative, isn't it? The OSCE has a more normative role in terms of good governance and so forth. But I think, I mean, it's spot on right, Ron, what you said about the changing nature of threats. I mean, as we have redefined what security means, then there will be more roles to play for organizations like the EU, which are not necessarily NATO, border security, organized crime, migration, cyber security, doesn't require military hardware. But in terms of what the EU can do in keeping the waterways open, as Marina was referring to, in terms of energy security, it's not new to EU states, so they can actually do that. Way back in 87, the WEU, the Western European Union, as it was then called, which, as you know, got absorbed into the EU, then became literally the military wing. What it accumulated under the WEU became the ESDP. And the WEU actually sent a demining mission to the Gulf because of all the loose mines that were floating as a result of the Iran-Iraq war, and they were endangering Gulf shipping. And the Europeans at the time decided to do this under the WEU, which had never really done anything meaningful militarily before. But in actual fact, they were using the nuts and bolts and the command structures of NATO because they were the same allies. I mean, but they chose to do it under a WEU flag because it was the Middle East, and they were eager to show that they were not following necessarily an American lead. So for political reasons, although, I mean, they cooperated and done this sort of thing under NATO, they did it under the WEU. I can see a lot more of that happening under the EU, where the Americans may not want to lead at all, forget about leading from behind, or, they might not want to lead from behind either. So, and then the EU might take on a role that uses NATO's integrated military structure, its capabilities, to undertake something like safeguarding shipping, for example. But I don't see, of course, NATO taking on more of these policing missions, such as border control, that would be better left off to the EU. But also, as a result of this pivot, if there is going to be a pivot, I think there's more talk about it than there's actual, facts about it on the ground. But the pivot and capabilities, I really don't think that in terms of capabilities, it's going to seriously impact on the capabilities in Europe. I think America can still lead from behind as they did in Libya, despite the pivot. So I agree with Ryan. There's probably like an overstacking of, American military hardware for Europe. So I really don't see a problem there. And those Europeans who do have the capabilities to do regional management or managing regional change together, I think when they put their heads together, they can do it. So we'll probably see more coalitions, such as the one we saw over Libya with Britain and France. We'll probably see Turkey play a much more assertive role as a regional manager as well, in concert with other allies. But it'll be a much more, I think, pick and choose menu. Cooperation is going to be much more a la carte, I think, in the future because of that.
I agree, and I think it's worth remembering that although we talk about Libya as a NATO mission, only 14 of the NATO allies actually contributed. So I mean, it's to some extent, it's always been a pick and choose area, dependent to some extent on capabilities and to some extent on political inclinations. Well, I believe that we have exhausted our panelists, certainly, although not the topics. But for now, I'm going to call us to adjourn with my sincere thanks to you, Gulnur Aybet, for your participation,
Thank you.
Ryan Hendrickson, and Matt Lowenstein. That was good. I liked your question. Thank you.
Thanks.
And to my colleagues, both permanent and visitors here at Pitt, I hope you enjoyed it. We are recording this, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And it should be up on the web in 2 or 3 years. You should be able to see. You can check the transcripts of what you said so that you can deny it later. Thank you once again, and we'll be back in touch later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.